Kaboom, crash, bang, wallop. It's been a pretty big week so far, and we're here to pick the bones out of it in the next 60 minutes or so. Thanks for joining me. I'm Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and my guests are going to be helping me pilot our way along the government's one-way, irreversible roadmap to freedom. Coming up later on this evening, I'll be joined by Martin Daubney, the former Brexit Party MEP and now the editorial director of Unlocked, a new common sense media channel. Very welcome to. I've had enough of the nonsense media channels, so the more common sense media channels we can have, the better. Sian Griffiths, the education editor at the Sunday Times and the IA's very own editorial and research fellow and professor of economics at the University of Buckingham, LEN SHACKLETON. We'll be asking a bit later on whether the government's sort of putting social interactions too far ahead of reopening businesses. The messages all seems to be about whether you can hug your granny on a park bench, but can you shake hands with a business associate and sign a contract? And is it time to forget sticking plasters and go for a fundamental rethink of our education system? We're going to be talking a bit about what has COVID exposed in our economy and society and what lessons might we draw from it when we get back to something approaching normal. But before all of that, delighted to be joined at the top of the show by Mail on Sunday columnist Dan Hodges, and from the home team, scourge of the nanny state and all-round pessimist Christopher SNOWDON. Dan, a very good evening to you. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
And Chris, good evening to you as well.
Good evening.
You're looking a bit unusually chipper and upbeat this evening, Chris. I'm sure that will take a turn for the worse in the coming minutes, won't it? So let's chat about the biggest news story this week, the very gradual return of our freedoms. Within just hours of the plans being announced, Matt Hancock was quick to note in the media that the dates are apparently the earliest possible, and they're more likely to be extended than shortened. Speaking at a school in London yesterday, the Prime Minister also announced there was no guarantee that England will end restrictions on June the 21st. Dan, what's your take on this? Boris has said that the liberalising roadmap is driven by the data, not dates, but it seems to be pretty date heavy. And if you're really going to be driven by the data, why can't the car on this one-way irreversible route have an accelerator as well as a brake?
Well, I think it probably does have an accelerator, actually. I mean, I think obviously we've had a number of statements from ministers and others saying these are the earliest dates. But I think the political reality is that as we move forward, if the data is as positive as many in government are, well, not just privately, and also publicly are saying it is, then I think when we've moved forward in about 5 or 6 weeks, if we have a situation where we have a huge reduction in infections, if we are in a situation where we've had a huge reduction in hospitalizations, if we're in a situation where the vaccine rollout is proceeding as successfully as it has been up to now, I think at that point the political pressure and indeed I think the science will mitigate accelerating the timetable. But I think one of the key things at the moment is, as we've seen it, Boris has been very, very careful and very keen on stressing caution as we unlock this time, contrasting with the way we unlocked last time. And I also think there's an element of as well of, the motorway rule. If you tell people that they can drive 70 miles an hour, they'll drive 80 miles an hour. If you say at the country now, we could be accelerating this, we could be unlocking much faster, then I think people will immediately start rushing out, and the sort of the respect for the rules, if you like, would quickly disintegrate. So that's why I think they're doing it. But as I say, I'd be surprised if we didn't see some form of acceleration at some point down this road.
Chris, let me come to you. Listen, I don't know what your present position is on lockdown. You've had more positions than the Kama Sutra on lockdown, haven't you? You're in favour of this, against it? You've been in favour of some, against others. What's the present Snowdon prognosis on the government's lockdown plans?
This is a terrible slur. I've been nothing but consistent the whole way through. I think I said last time I was on the show, I supported the first lockdown to save the health service from collapsing. I've supported this lockdown for the same reason. I didn't support the second one because I didn't think that the health service was in any danger of collapsing. And I think that a lot of the science that was drawn up to justify that second lockdown was Mickey Mouse. And I have to say, I think the same is true actually of the science that has been presented to Sage by Imperial and Warwick and presented by Sage to the government, I think is very, very suspect. I mean, making some simply unbelievable claims about how many deaths are going to be in the summer. I mean, what Boris didn't mention during his speech and only vaguely alluded to was that even in the absolute most optimistic scenario, Sage are predicting tens of thousands of deaths over the course of summer and early autumn. Even if everything goes to plan, even if the vaccines are much better than anyone thinks, are rolled out quicker than anyone expected, and infection rates fall. I mean, it seems to me pretty obvious lobbying effort from the people in Sage to deter the government from opening up in May, which seems to be what they were originally planning to do. Would it be right to open up in May? Maybe not completely, but I think you could pretty much be open in May. I mean, the data, and Dan, I think I agree really with what Dan says. The data are moving in the right direction. We know from last time, the first lockdown, we know roughly where we can expect to be. The only unknown factor is reopening the schools, which we didn't do during the first lockdown. On the other hand, in the first lockdown, we didn't have 25% of the population already had the disease, and we didn't have another maybe 25% inoculated with the vaccines. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable to expect case numbers to be down below, say, 2,000 or 3,000 by the end of next month, hospitalizations down below 300 a day, in which case you've suppressed it very greatly. Sure. And you don't need to have everybody vaccinated to start opening up in a much more significant way than has been proposed.
Okay, so I want to put to Dan my ridiculously oversimplified statistics with all of the health warnings that, I've just continued a trend line on a graph. I'm not an epidemiologist. Anything could go wrong. But how about this? As of today, we've vaccinated about 19 million people. There will also be a number of other people who are immune vaccinated but have had COVID-19 and presumably still immune. In the UK, there are just over 14 million people over the age of 60, and they account for 92% of deaths. The vaccine takes 3 weeks to kick in. Okay, dates and time are all a bit of a blur now, but 3 weeks from now is the middle of March. We should see, I was doing a sort of straight line trajectory, but we might, if you're even mildly optimistic, Dan, see numbers like sort of fall off the edge of a cliff, right? And my rough back of the envelope calculation was this. We hit a peak of COVID deaths on January the 19th. It's been coming down since then. Not completely consistently day by day, but the very broad trajectory is each day we have about 25 fewer deaths. If you extrapolate that into the future, by the middle of March, we will be down into single-digit deaths per day, about the same number of people who die in road accidents. I think it's about 5 to 10 a day. It's not always that straightforward, but if Littlewood's optimistic crayon drawings are right, Dan, what will trigger this dabbing the accelerator? Because they sort of put in place this framework. I'm trying to work out how they'll say, oh, well, actually, we had this secret plan that if R fell to this, or R's not one of the measurements now, or hospital infection rates fell by more than X%, then we're going to go through 2 of these gates simultaneously. How do you think they would dab the accelerator? I see the Daily Telegraph has mentioned that they might be minded to do so. That's their front page splash today. But do you think it will just look like they judged it wrong if they start to accelerate the process without having sort of told us the signposts and the road, Dan?
No, because I think that the fundamental lesson the government has learned, and frankly, I'm not entirely sure why it took them so long to learn this lesson, is that it's much better to under-promise and over-deliver than do the opposite. And what we saw at the beginning of the crisis, I think partly it was to do with Boris's natural sort of enthusiastic, slightly bombastic political style. We're going to have the best test and trace system in the world. We're going to have the best X, the best Y. And obviously it didn't pan out like that. And they paid a political price for that and took a political hit for that. And I think they've learned that lesson. And frankly, if the Prime Minister has to stand up in the House of Commons and says, guess what, guys, we've looked at the data's much, much better than we thought. Our unlocking strategy is proceeding much more effectively than we thought. Our vaccination program is performing much more effectively than we thought. I'm now happy to announce we're going to unlock the pubs of Britain 2 or 3 weeks earlier. What's going to happen? Keir Starmer's going to jump up and say, that's an outrage, don't do it. Of course not. So the reality is, once we get into that situation, if the data is positive, and they will look at the data, I mean, they're not mucking around on that. They are going to be genuinely cautious. But if the data is positive, then frankly, people who want to kick up and scream and say, it's all terrible, you got it wrong earlier, no one's going to care, frankly. People are just relieved we're getting out.
But Dan, you were mentioning this, given we're using lots of car and accelerator and brakes and motorway and signpost analogies. You said it would be a bit like telling people that they've got to drive at 70 and then you sort of build in a margin for error. I mean, quite apart from whether the Prime Minister's wrong footing Sir Keir Starmer, there is a basic practical point here, right? I mean, if you're a pub landlord, you want to know when your pub's reopening, when you've got to order the kegs of beer, when you tell your bar staff to come back in, when you clean down the garden furniture and all of the rest of it. I mean, do you think businesses might suddenly be told, actually, you can open tomorrow or you can open in 3 weeks' time? I said, blimey, it would have been nice to have had a bit more notice. It's not just a question for a good number of businesses. I mean, at a very minor level, we're having this at the IEA. When are we able to hold events again? Do we really think it will be June the 21st? Might it be earlier than that? How are we going to organise our building works around it? It would be a bit frustrating to be told X and then actually for it to be accelerated earlier. You might just not be ready. It might be great politics, not very good business planning, right, Dan?
Well, I think you actually kind of half answered that question in your introduction. I mean, in your introduction, you were posing the question, why is it we're getting the social aspects of unlocking, if you like, front loaded ahead of the business aspect? And I think you've touched on that. That's one of the reasons why the business element has been pushed back, because businesses do need this lead time. But I think, frankly, if you said to most publicans, most hairdressers, most businesses around the country, look, you've got a choice. We as a government can rigidly stick to the deadline of the 21st, even though we don't have to for any epidemiological reason, or you have the option to open earlier. I think most businesses would bite your hand off at the opportunity to open earlier. You're right, there may be a little bit of inconvenience there, but I think, again, the political reality is, in a situation where we are, finally completely unlocking Britain's businesses, I don't think there's going to be a particularly significant political backlash, to be honest.
Chris, what's your take on this? How do you think, if you want to be a bit more optimistic, and if the government was to follow your advice in the IEA press release, that we should be, hitting the accelerator a bit more, especially if the data goes in that way? How do you think they'll go about it? And do you think they will go about it? Do you think, for all that was said this week, actually, there will be lots of fans at the FA Cup final on May the 15th, and the pubs will be open by, the 1st of May or whatever? Do you think that's in reality where we're going to get to? And how do you think the government will explain the acceleration? Or, as Dan is saying, will it just be, well, it's such good news, you're hardly going to cross-examine people for over-providing?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be any backlash. On the contrary, I think there'll be a lot of pressure for him to speed up. 3 months is a very, very long time. 4 months, whatever we're looking at. We've had less than 2 months of this lockdown, and it feels like an eternity again. I think the government, assuming that everything goes in the right direction here, of course, but assuming it does, I think we're going to look kind of ridiculous. We get to May and the rest of Europe's opened up, having vaccinated far fewer people than us, and the virus seems to be at a low level in most places. So I don't think it needs to explain itself like that. I mean, what personally I would do is, I think it's right to kind of wait until the end of next month, because you need to see what happens with the school reopenings. But if things continue to improve despite that, I think you can certainly be looking at opening up everything outdoors. I know the government's saying you can meet other people outdoors. Why can't we meet other people in a beer garden? Not every pub can survive just with a beer gardens by any means. I think probably most of them will stay closed. But let's do that. at Easter time rather than waiting another 2 or 3 weeks. And also, I'm not sure why he's not reverting to the tiers. Legally speaking, I think actually we are still in the tier system, just everyone's in tier 4. But he said quite wrongly in Parliament that rates were basically the same all over the country. They're not at all. There's a huge disparity between different parts of the country. If anything, I think now is probably the best time to have tiers. This is where they start to make sense. You could get everybody in tier 1, tier 2 by Easter, maybe 1 or 2 places in tier 3, and just hopefully everyone will gradually go down. But a regional approach, I think, would be reasonable. Maybe it's considered not politically plausible, but it was last year.
Okay, I'm going to bring in another guest to join us to consider this a bit more. Martin Daubney is the former Brexit Party MEP, and as I mentioned at the top of the show, the editor and director of Unlocked, and he's presently at a 90-degree angle.
There you go, mate. Hang on.
Brilliant. Martin, good to see you. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Give me your quick take, Martin. I want to move on to the vaccine rollout program in a minute, but what's your take on this, what I would consider a ponderously slow but possibly acceleratable path back to freedom by June the 21st?
I think Boris is acting out of complete cowardice. He says he's acting off data, off dates, not data. It's not true. He's acting off dogma. The clearest example I've heard you talking about pubs, by Sage's own reckoning, in September, the government knew that pubs were safer in terms of the volumetric of its air conditioning, safer than care homes, hospitals, schools, and even our own homes that we had guests around. That evidence was completely ignored. Hospitality has been thrown under the bus. We knew schools were much safer to open. That should have happened until Sadiq Khan and the Labour Party played politics and the unions got involved with schools. They've been entirely buckling down, I think, to the doom mongers. The media has been complicit in this. We've heard no kickback against lockdowns politically. There's been no political opposition whatsoever. Labour wanted more lockdowns, sooner, harder, longer. The Liberal Democrats, well, they send out a missing persons action. Where are they? There's nobody kicking back against this. Meanwhile, industry is being pummeled. Unemployment set to rocket. We've got millions who are furloughed as zombies. When that all ends, it's going to be economic catastrophe. And I just think we've had a very totalitarian lockdown. And when we're looking now at things like COVID passports or basic civil liberties, I think people accepted they would be something to have if you wanted to travel abroad. But we're now seeing QR codes, facial recognition akin to Israel or even communist China, a QR code to get into a pub or a football match. You know, we've surrendered so much in terms of civil liberties, and we've surrendered so much in terms of the economics, purely on the altar of dogma and terror.
Dan, let me come back to you. I dare say you're going to disagree with Martin's analysis, but what's your take on, if you like, the performance of the opposition, or whether there have been discordant, meaningful voices on this, or whether we've actually just found that there is a political elite that vociferously agrees with itself, and the only voices of opposition from the mainstream are go even further, you should have locked down harder and faster and earlier and all of the rest of it? Or do you think that Martin's views are of a minority pursuit? There were a few percent of the electorate might agree with that, and the present political parties and sort of media outlets are reflecting mainstream opinion. What's your take, Dan?
Well, I think this goes to the heart of some of the debate that Chris and myself and Martin and others have been engaged in over the last couple of months. I mean, I'll come back to something I was saying, the other day when I was having a debate with my colleague Peter Hitchens. You have to believe one of two things. You have to believe either there is, significant, compelling data which mitigates in support of lockdown and a gradual unlocking strategy, or you have to believe that out of nowhere, a grand conspiracy has been concocted, which includes Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon, Arlene Foster, Keir Starmer. I can't even remember who leads the Green Party now, and go on forever. I mean, because if you look at how the devolved devolved nations are dealing with this. They're dealing with it in exactly the same way Boris is, or in even more sort of a aggressive way. And to answer Martin's question, the reason why you haven't seen a huge political backlash against lockdown is because you haven't seen a huge public backlash against lockdown. And with the greatest respect to those who I've called, throughout this, or recently started calling the lockdown deniers, whilst they talk a big game about being the people who are really in touch with, which is what's happening to ordinary people on the ground in the villages and housing estates and streets of Britain. The reality is they don't, and the reality is, despite their consistent and very aggressive campaigning on this, the vast majority of the British people support lockdown. Actually, if you look at the opinion polls, they probably would have supported a more stringent lockdown and actually would support a more cautious unlocking. So that's why you're not seeing a huge political backlash, because
Dan, do you think that might be Dan, do you think that might be a problem between, we've discussed it on the show before, sort of revealed and stated preferences, if you look at opinion polls, and also opinion polls will show that, the electorate want taxes to go down, spending to go up, and the deficit to be eliminated. It's kind of, you've got to pick a lane. Isn't the problem here that whilst for a lot of people lockdown is dull and boring, the actual economic effects of it will only be felt down the line? Might it be that in 2 years' time, people are saying, oh my God, well, if I knew it was going to cause all this unemployment and this massive reduction in salaries, et cetera, they shouldn't have done it. I didn't know at the time that it was going to lead to that. Aren't we storing up those problems? And you might find, I'm speculating wildly here, in a year or so's time, people are saying, oh, we did lock down for too long. I don't like seeing 2 or 3 million people in the job queues. Surely we could have got out of this earlier.
You could well see that, but the reality is, as I say, that's not what we're seeing at the moment. And there is the other issue, which is to again go back to to Martin's great conspiracy theory. You have to believe that for some reason Boris Johnson's ministers, and all these other politicians are themselves for some reason not privy to this, the reality, the economic reality that we're facing. I don't think any of us sitting here are under any illusions about what the economic impacts of lockdown potentially could be. That's not disputed. There are obviously very, very significant economic impacts. The question is, going back to Martin's point again, that Boris has all this evidence that pubs aren't great transmitters of disease. Boris Johnson could open the pubs tomorrow. Boris Johnson would open the pubs tomorrow. There is literally no logical rationale, political, economic, or otherwise, unless you genuinely, as I say, believe in the grand conspiracy theory that Boris is somehow become, captured by some great Maoist or whatever, conspiracy. That's just that's a fantasy. You may be absolutely right, though. How this will play out in a couple of years' time is a very different question. But there's no doubt about where the public are at the moment, despite what the lockdown deniers would have us believe.
So, Martin, there you go. Dan's put down the gauntlet to you. You're not, from what I can see, wearing a tinfoil hat, but maybe he's accusing you metaphorically of wearing a tinfoil hat. Look, you can disagree with the Prime Minister, but Dan's got a point, doesn't he? I mean, Boris leans in a sort of liberal direction. He might be a bit sludgy on his actual ideology, but why would he be doing this if the data before him is as clear as you claim it is? I mean, what Machiavellian plot and conspiracy is he a prime mover in? And how has he managed to get everybody else on planet Earth in any position of power to agree to this deliberately self-destructive course of action, in your mind?
First of all, let's pick up Dan's phrase, lockdown denial. I don't know what he means. I mean, to deny we're in a lockdown is a bit like saying we deny we breathe air. Of course, we're in a lockdown. We are challenging the logic and the rationale of that based on Sage's own data. And the reason that the data isn't being acted upon is because we are in this position where the government is now so terrified of making a mistake. And I think, by the way, COVID and the experience of the British public has really affected Boris Johnson personally. I think he feels greatly aggrieved by the notion that he might be killing people. And this is really preying on his conscience. But in terms of Dan's other point that we should believe in polls, I mean, that's lunacy. We'd have President Clinton would be remaining in the European Union. Jeremy Corbyn would be prime minister. To suggest that we should be leading our country on polls, particularly around COVID and YouGov polls, and that's a whole separate conversation. I think it's ridiculous. And let's look at the evidence. We have had a two-tiered lockdown. We've had very comfortably people, very well off, who are just working from home, who are saving money, saving up for a second home. You know, the journalists, the public sector, they've had a great lockdown. And it's great for them to tell the rest of us that we must fight this battle together. Meanwhile, the kind of people that we talk to on Unlocked, the working classes, the self-employed, the small business owners, the excluded who've had not a single penny from the government, and I'm one of those people. It's like, this is a completely different experience. We're not all in this together. We never were. And the political class are completely out of touch with the working man. And these are people, particularly where I campaigned in Ashfield and where I won as an MEP in the West Midlands. These are working class red wall voters that loaned their votes to the Conservatives. I think we'll be asking big questions about that. And there is no political party offering them an outlet.
But Martin, then respect that position, that lockdown isn't working, or it's going too far, or the cure is worse than the disease and the rest of it. But why is Johnson doing this then? Is he a fool? Is he? I think he's acting sincerely. I'm much more liberal than he is. I would be unlocking down a lot faster. But what's your explanation for, if you like, your claim is they're not following the data, so they're deliberately, if you like, self-harming the economy for no apparent health benefit. What's your explanation of that motivation?
I think they're afraid. I think they're afraid that if they get it slightly wrong, and look at how the NHS has become so weaponized during this. It's the new Church of England. You are unable to have a conversation about the NHS, and I think he's caught politically cornered, and that is why every other political leader has doubled down on lockdown rhetoric, because they're so scared that it might go wrong, that they will have blood on their hands. That's the way it's been portrayed by the media, that they are just locked into this corner. They are no longer able to make logical data-based decisions, as I said, around hospitality, around schools, because it's become so politicized. And we are losing sight of the fact that we are storing up millions of unemployed. Now, health disasters, mental health disasters, and we must accept that every life has a value and every death has a value, not just COVID. We cannot be a society dictated to and living our life by COVID-19. We have to learn to live with it. And what was the point of the vaccine? We were told that was how we would unlock Britain. We've got the damn vaccine. Let's get on with it.
Chris, let me come to you. Do you think that what we're witnessing is, if you like, the political establishment, mainstream parties of both sides of the aisle are basically just practicing the precautionary principle on steroids? That, to Martin's point, you can't, as an elected mainstream politician, even suggest, well, all right, 100 people a day will die more than otherwise, but that's worth it to get the economy going. Politicians in political discourse simply can't accept that there are trade-offs. It's verboten. And that means that they are, if you like, hardwired, whether they know it or not, to take an unbelievably cautious approach. Is that what's happening, Chris?
I'm not sure they even realize it is an unbelievably cautious approach. And I come back to this SAGE document that predicts up to over 100,000 deaths this summer if we lock down, if we ease up on the lockdown too quickly. I just think there's a scientific ignorance amongst politicians. It's not their job, after all, to be scientists. I mean, perhaps that's why Boris said that rates are the same all over the country, because SAGE told him they were and he never checked. But I think they may well be worried about this mutation idea, the idea that even if you have a relatively low number of people with the disease, that it could mutate and ruin everything because it would be resistant to the vaccine. I think that's behind.
So in other words, herd immunity might be a pretty high number rather than a relatively low number, you're saying?
Well, no one would be immune to it at all. If we get a mutation which is avoids a vaccine. We haven't had any around the world as yet, and I would imagine it's quite unlikely to happen now, having had millions of people have it when we have a few thousand having it. But I don't know, there might be more to the science in that. But I think that's part of the reason for the caution. The other part of the reason for the caution is that, this SAGE document basically says that even if you have the vast majority of people vaccinated, and even if the vaccine is really works really well, it's possible that basically everyone's going to get this virus in the summer. And if everybody who hasn't been vaccinated or for whom the vaccine doesn't work comes down with it, then actually that will still be a huge number of people dying and put in hospital. I don't think that is in any way a plausible scenario. I mean, the unvaccinated people are scattered around the country. They're not all living in one area. My understanding of how epidemics work suggests that the R number is going to be very, very low once we've had lots of people vaccinated with an effective vaccine. But that's what's driving the fear. We can only hope, as Dan's already said, that we see the data, and it might take the government 5 weeks to analyze data, but the rest of us are looking at it on a day-by-day basis, and we can see what's going on.
Dan, just before I let you go, the vaccine rollout has been, relatively speaking, perhaps even in absolute terms, a great success in the United Kingdom, certainly compared to similar countries. There were some signs that it's showing, but slowing. But I've just been told that it's got a bit better after a lag at the start of the week. The 7-day average is 328,843 people. Do you think we'll be able to keep our foot on the floor on this, or do you think it might drop off? This is anecdote, not data. My parents have both had the jab, and much as I dearly love them, they haven't got anything else to do. I got a phone call from my GP surgery today asking me to book the jab, and I said, well, there's a number of problems. A, I work, and B, I'm in Tenerife. Now, I'm not saying that applies to all 48-year-olds, but do you think as we go down the age profile and towards people who are working, or perhaps people who are more risky, more risk-taking types, or 25-year-olds who don't really see the point of getting it, that you might just see a slowing in take-up? Not for any conspiratorial reasons, just because obviously if you're 85 and in a care home, it was your top priority. If you're 25 or 30 and basically healthy, perhaps it's the sort of thing you can do without, and you'll lead a busy life anyway.
No, I don't. And if you don't want your jab, I'll have it. I
do want it. It's just I'm 7,000 miles away.
Give me your GP's number and I'll be straight in there. No, I don't, because I think the reality is, I think most people, again, let's set the lockdown deniers to one side for a second. I think most people recognize that the vaccine is actually the magic bullet in this, and the vaccine is the way we're going to get out of this. And on an individual basis, once we are vaccinated, I mean, we haven't even had the debate about vaccine passports, but certainly vaccination is going to be the key nationally and individually to getting the end of this lockdown nightmare. So no, I think the vaccine will continue. There is going to come a point, I think, where we are going to start having to have a national debate about those who have not been offered who have been offered the vaccine but have refused to take it, and the implications that will then have on public policy moving forward. But I think generally, no, I think most people can't wait for it. And, I know personally I'm one of them.
Dan, okay, good luck. If you can nab my place in the queue, please do. I'm hoping to. I'll pass on my GP's number. If it's ready and waiting, somebody better have it. Dan, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate you giving up your time. Have a great evening. Chris and Martin, please stay with us. I want to move on to the topic of it's the economy. It's the economy stupid, that famous Clintonite phrase. And to help us navigate some of the economic choppy waters, it's a warm welcome to the programme to Sian Griffiths, the Education and Families Editor at the Sunday Times, and to our very own Professor Len Shackleton, who's also Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. We've obviously had our worst economic slump in 300 years. I'm not sure that data goes back further than that. Is the government actually paying as much attention as they should be to the economic impact? So is it the economy stupid? Sian and Len, good evening. Len, let me start with you. This is more about the messaging than the policy, but the messaging from the government seemed to be very much on the kind of social interaction side of things. You know, you'll now be able to sit in your girlfriend's garden and hug your granny and perhaps have 2 or 3 people around for a barbecue in the due course of time, where you can reminisce about what pubs and restaurants used to be like. But there isn't much in the narrative about sort of how quickly you can get back to work. Could you make a business associate? Can you sign a contract? Has the government sort of forgotten the economy here? I appreciate lots of people have been split from loved ones and friends and all of the rest of it, but the eye very much seemed to be on the social interaction ball, not the business ball. Is that a fair analysis, Len?
I think you're right, and certainly a lot of business people are very worried about this. I guess you could say that we're saving this up until the budget, which is only a few days away, and you know, I'd reserve judgment on that. When we've seen what's in the budget, then perhaps we'll have a better take on how the business world is going to react.
Okay, and are you remotely confident that we'll get some sort of sensible business bounce back proposals in the budget then?
Well, I'm not really. I mean, as you know, I've been on the show a few times, and I am pessimistic, really. I think the labour market is in a very strange state at the moment. There are still 4.5 million people or so on furlough, and I think a lot of jobs are going to disappear, whatever the government does. So I think we're in for a tougher time than perhaps some of my more optimistic colleagues think. But
Sean, let me bring you in. I can see you're on mute at the moment. I don't know if that's our fault or you need to hit a button. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to move on to education matters shortly in a paper that Len's written. But what's your take on it, Sean? Do you think the government's focusing on sort of people want to have barbecues and see their family again and visit granny in a care home or whatever it might be? I'm not poo-pooing those things. They're important to people. They're part and parcel of being alive. But there doesn't seem to be as much emphasis on, and we want, you know, every worker to be back at their desks as soon as we possibly can. That's just not been the messaging, right?
Well, I mean, my expertise is education, and certainly schools are going back. They're the priority to go back on March the 8th, from March the 8th. So when it comes to schools, you know, they have put it very firmly in the first category of things that will reopen after lockdown. University students, no, most of them will still be at home, but definitely school pupils going back. And I mean, the message to carry on working from home if you can seems to me at the moment a fairly sensible one, given how high the infection rates still are and how high the death toll has been for the country.
Martin, let me come back to you. You don't like the way the government's operated this lockdown. You take a much more liberal, libertarian, deregulatory approach to it. But let's just assume we've got to eat this pie. This is the way it's going to be. Let's assume that these dates are the ones that stick and your arguments fall on deaf ears and it is June the 21st before things start opening up again, or not much in advance of that. What do you want to see done to try and kickstart the economy again? The government has spent a colossal sum of money. I think the bill on COVID support will be £300 billion, probably north of that if you consider the fall in tax receipts as well. There's a huge deficit. Public spending's colossal, biggest downturn in the economy for 300 years, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just say you lose the argument, Martin, on liberalise more quickly, and we are where we are. What would you advise the government does to get the economy moving again and to get employment up?
Well, what we can't do is try and tax our way out of this, because quite simply, the economic black hole is too big for that to happen. We've already heard rumblings of a rise in corporation tax. I mean, how the hell is that going to work for the hospitality industry, for restaurants, for the industries that have been decimated and furloughed? And in terms of continuing the furlough scheme, how about reversing the furlough scheme? How about paying people to go back to work, paying employers to get employees back on the payroll? Because I think there's a huge amount of zombie people on furlough that is going to fall off the cliff and become unemployed at the end of this. We need to do things, positive things, like extend VAT holidays on hospitality, look at ground rates. We need to give incentives and tax breaks and cuts to stimulate grassroots and green shoots of growth. Because if we just penalise all these businesses that have been furloughed and shut down for basically an entire year by increasing taxation, it's going to be absolute carnage. It's going to be bloodbath. We need to reopen the country to hospitality and also to the tourism industry. I mean, we've ran a campaign, Save Our Summer. It's been massively popular on Facebook, where a lot of real people tend to be on Facebook, as Twitter is all the kind of journalists and all the rest of it. We've done Unlock the Pubs, we've done Unlock the Schools, and all of these things are really popular. People want their lives back, and they're not going to be rewarded by being taxed out of existence.
Okay, so I just want to see how we square that circle then, Martin. So you would go for a relaxation of various taxes, certainly no tax hikes. All things equal, that would mean that the public finances are even more dripping in red.
Yeah.
Are you happy to live with that for a while? Just say, look, you know, the deficit is so colossal, we can't wrap our heads around it for the moment. Let's just park that as a problem for a couple of years and get the economy going again. We will have to return to it. We can't forever live beyond our means, but let's kind of cross that bridge some way down the path when the economy's ticking over nicely again. Would you be a dove on the deficit, basically?
I absolutely agree that that's the route forward. You know, we have borrowed so much. What's an extra few billion? I mean, it's like £500 billion so far, right? To suddenly cut that off when we come out of lockdown, to suddenly expect people who haven't been working for a year, businesses that haven't had a customer for basically a year, to start paying more to pay for this, I think will be absolutely reprehensible and will destroy the economy. Who's going to take a risk of starting a business in an economic climate where you're penalised and taxed out of existence? I'm afraid we are so far in this now, we have to keep digging and spending. The magic money tree, needs to have a few more leaves plucked off it. I think it's the only way. Interest rates are at record lows. We can't just tax and destroy what's already there. I think if we do that, then people will just not start businesses again. That entrepreneurial spirit that Britain needs to get off its feet and get going again will just simply go. Who would take the risk?
Chris, in your usual cheery way, you warned us on the 1st of January in an article you wrote in The Spectator that 2021 could be the year of economic Armageddon. Are you still as cheery and optimistic, or have things got even worse since then, Chris?
Well, they've got worse, haven't they, really, with this roadmap?
Beyond Armageddon,
yeah. I'm very concerned about every aspect of it. I'm concerned about inflation, which still people aren't really talking about, but I have the crackpot opinion that if you print hundreds of billions of pounds, you will get some inflation sooner or later. I'm very concerned, obviously, about unemployment. I just think it's going to be appalling. I've been predicting 4 million, maybe even 5 million all along. Hopefully we can keep it below that, but I'm not sure how. I'm very concerned about hospitality industry. I mean, the government offered £9,000 to every pub at the start of this lockdown, and that was it. It was like a lump sum. We weren't told how long the lockdown was going to be. It was just assumed that £9,000 is the right amount of money. Let's give the pubs some more money. We can't, to echo Martin, we can't spend all this money and go through all this and then at the last minute allow these businesses to fail. We do need to give them the money to keep going and find out how much money they need, not just assume that £9,000 is enough for an indefinite period of time. So yeah, it's going to be awful. The only way it would be worse is if we hadn't had a lockdown and we were living through what felt like the plague. But, there are no easy options here. The main thing, to go back to the previous item, the main thing is to, once we've got everybody over the age of 50 or 60 with at least one vaccine in their arm, get things back to normal. Don't delay this till June and July.
Okay, I want to move on to education and schools very shortly, but Len, just your thoughts on dovishness versus hawkishness on public spending. Is it the prudent thing to do to actually say, yeah, obviously the debt is colossal, so eye-watering, we can't even get our head around it, but let's not worry about that for a year or two. If anything, let's allow tax receipts to fall, public spending to remain high, and that might get the economy going again, and then let's return to this problem further down the road.
Yeah, I'm with Martin and with Julian Jessup on this. I think it would be premature to start raising taxes now. Of course, the thing which, you see a lot of stuff on social media about, oh yeah, let the rich pay for it and so forth. But the reality is there are no easy options with tax. Most of it will fall on ordinary people, and it will discourage job creation, as Martin says. So I think we have to, bite the bullet on this and say, yeah, we have to put up with debt for a while longer until we get the economy going again.
So the first things to reopen, you know, the schools are going to be back. I think that's on March the 8th, not from March the 8th. It's pretty much a big bang, I think. Sean can correct me on this. Sean, what's your take of it? Can you explain, is every kid back in school on March the 8th? I mean, there might be some very small local exceptions, I guess, but is that a big bang? And is that the right way to go, do you think? And what's the damage that kids have suffered in virtue of, you know, having to undergo homeschooling? And particularly, I think that puts you very much at the mercy of whether your parents are good teachers or not and diligent or not. So presumably it's hurting the poorest and from people from disadvantaged family backgrounds the most. But is this brilliant, great news that it's all back on March the 8th, Sean?
I don't think everybody will be back on March the 8th. That's the first thing. So I think it will be from March the 8th, and particularly in secondary schools, because head teachers as well as teaching unions are saying it's going to take time to test children in the way that the government has suggested. So every secondary school child is going to have 3 tests, 3 lateral flow tests. They need to have at least 1 negative test before they can start lessons. And then after that, they will be tested. They'll have kits to test themselves at home. But the logistics of those first 3 tests, according to many secondary schools, it's going to take time. It could take up to 2 weeks to test all those children, leaving 3 or 4 days between each test. So I don't think everybody's going to be back on March the 8th. That's the first thing. Secondly, do children need to be back in school? Absolutely, they need to be back in school. I mean, they've missed months of learning, and there's collateral damage to them. We've seen increases in mental health problems among children, even very young children. So I think it's very good that the government's reopening schools and making that a priority. I also think the way they're trying to do it is sensible, in that they're starting with schools and they're going to monitor how it goes. And within 3 weeks, we start the Easter holidays anyway, 3 weeks from March the 8th. So it's a fairly short period of experimentation. And then they can look at the data and see what the effects are.
Martin, you presumably welcome the schools going back, even if it isn't as big a bang. But before I let you go, I wanted you to tell us a little about your Unlocked campaign to unlock our pubs. I don't have any kids and left school many decades ago, so I'm looking forward to getting back to my local. But if pubs, why not also, Martin, nightclubs or gyms or theatres? There was a YouGov poll yesterday. Apparently, according to this YouGov poll, which might go, Martin, to your scepticism about opinion polling, Brits are most excited about returning to the hairdresser. And only 2% of us are most excited about going to a theme park. I mean, I find it much more exciting to visit a theme park than a hairdresser. But, you know, hey, there you go. I'm in a minority on most things. Why pubs, Martin, so particularly? Or do you want the whole lot and pubs is just an easy place to start?
Yeah, I think that we want the whole economy to reopen as quickly and as safely as possible. And hospitality is a key issue, because it's not just about, you know, having a few beers. It's because during the lockdown, when the pubs reopened on July the 4th, and then we had 100 million eat out to help out meals across hospitality, there was no rise in death rates for COVID. It proved that those areas were safer. As I said at the top of the show, Sage's own evidence proved, because of the air conditioning in pubs, they were safer than schools, care homes, hospitals, and even your own homes. It's worth 20+ billion pounds a year. It's 2 million jobs. They're a controlled environment. They were socially distanced. They were hand sanitized. They were early adopters of all this stuff, and it worked. And they're a success story we should embrace and implement elsewhere. But you are dead right. The beauty industry is worth 30 billion pounds. It's not about vanity. It's about the economy. It's about saving jobs and getting Britain unlocked and getting back on its feet again.
Martin, thank you for joining us. We'll make sure we put a link to your campaign in the YouTube chat. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. Chris, Len and Sean, please stay with us, because I want to move on to our final topic of the night, education, which I've already touched on, has been one of the areas worst affected by the pandemic. 2 years of exams cancelled. Most of the evidence suggesting the poorest students have been hit the hardest. What's the future of education in a post-COVID world? On Monday, Len wrote and we released the latest IEA research report titled Back to School and After. And in it, he suggests actually a good number of, not just exclusively in education, a good number of areas of our economy or our institutions, weaknesses have been exposed by COVID that we might not otherwise have discovered. And perhaps we should learn some lessons from it and out of this bleak period, improve our education system in the future. Len, give us a potted summary of this report. What are the lessons that you think we've learned?
Okay, well, what I didn't want to do was kind of try to double guess what the government's going to do in the short run to get schools back. I think what they have done is better than it could have been, but I think they could do a lot better than that. But what I wanted to draw out in this thing was, as you say, just as with the NHS, COVID has exposed, long-standing problems with the educational system in England, and Sian is Welsh, I think, but in fact, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland are arguably worse than England in this respect. But we don't do well in international comparisons. We have a lot of kids who leave our education system with nothing very much to show for it. We have huge variations. We have some of the best schools in the world, and we have some of the worst performers in the world. And I think what I was arguing in this paper is we ought to look sort of root and branch at our educational system. We have things which we've done in the same way for a very long time. I mean, I think I mentioned in there the Forster Education Act of 1870, which set the idea that we start school at 5. The reality of this, of course, is we start school on average at 4.5. My younger daughter started school when she was 4 and 2 and a bit months, and yet there are other kids in the class who are a good deal older, and we know that problem persists throughout schooling. That people once behind find it very difficult to catch up. There's things like this. There's the thing that our parents are treated simply as the people who send the kids to school. We get very little say in this. I've argued in the paper that we ought to actually give poorer parents some spending power, that we ought to turn the pupil premium and possibly the national tutoring program into vouchers, which would enable poorer parents to get private tutoring for their children, just in the way the middle class do. I think the middle class, over 40% of families in London have private tutoring, for example. But that just reinforces the educational disadvantage of the poor. So I want to talk about these big questions in the future. What I don't want to talk about particularly is the next 6 months and how many people are going to turn up for summer schools, which Boris is now funding, and that kind of stuff, because I don't think that's the real issue here.
Sean, let me bring you in. I'd be interested. I mean, Len said his paper, which we aim for most IEA papers to be about, with our eyes on the horizon, not what needs to be done tomorrow, but what lessons might be rolled out over a generation. But Sean, what are your views about immediate remedies? Should kids be in school over August? What the heck are we going to do about exams? Could there be some form of assessment rather than examination marked by teachers? Is there anything meaningful that can be done, over the course of 2021 to catch up? I don't know, longer school days or working into the summer or the rest of it. And what are your thoughts on what weaknesses in our education system have been perhaps exposed by COVID, but whilst they might not lead to reform in the next 6 months, might perhaps be the cause for consideration and reforms over the next 6 or 10 years?
Well, starting with catch-up, I think Gavin Williamson's made a speech today where he seems to be ruling out lengthening the school day or shortening the summer holidays, which were options, I think, that were on the table at one point this year. And the catch-up programme, it looks as though it's going to be things like summer schools with, but not particularly taught by teachers and people brought in from outside, online tutoring, the national tutoring programme, as Len has said. I mean, I think the real weakness in our education system, well, there are many weaknesses in our education system. And one of them is that there's a big gap between North and South, and the schools in the South, and in particular in London, are much better, the state schools, than the schools, many of the schools in the North. And that is a big problem that needs addressing. I think another problem is that actually school funding isn't high enough. If you compare the amount of money spent per pupil in a state school and the amount of money that parents pay for our top private schools, I mean, the difference is tenfold. And I just think if we're trying to get our best kids from state schools into universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and you're competing against students who are being taught with so much more money at the disposal of the school to educate them, then it's going to be difficult to make all this level out. So I mean, there's just so many problems. Actually, it's hard to know where to start. And the exam system this year will be teacher assessed grades, and that is going to be a mess, I think. So yeah, yes, one could have a long list of problems, but not so easy to find the solutions.
Well, what about, Sean, longer term? And I'm slightly misquoting from Len's paper here, but one of the issues that he touches on is, have we over formalized and licensed the profession of teaching? Of course, over the course of lockdown, parents have had to teach their own kids as best they're able. But I know there are lots of examples of relying on people who aren't necessarily qualified teachers to come in and teach kids. I dare say much more prevalent in the affluent South than the poorer North. But as an example, my parents are both maths graduates, and they have both been teaching my nephew and niece mathematics. My mum is actually a qualified teacher, but my father isn't, but perfectly capable of imparting knowledge. Do you think we need to take a rather less formalized view of what sort of teaching means, that you don't necessarily need the piece of paper to show that you've done the PGCE or whatever it's called these days, that actually there's a wealth of knowledge and experience and expertise out there that we need to encourage to get into the minds and the brains of young people, even if you haven't gone through the formal state approved program?
Well, I think the research shows that if the best outcomes for children are when families and schools work together. So when parents and teachers are on the same page. I mean, I'm from a fairly ordinary background, and certainly my parents were hugely instrumental in me getting to university, and likewise my siblings. But my school was too, and it's that harmonious relationship, I think, between parents and teachers who are on the same page, not fighting each other, that enables a child to do very well. But I do think the standard of your school and the standard of your child's teacher is actually hugely important. And I one of the things that worries me about the idea of online private tutors is that the quality is hugely variable. It's not a regulated profession. There's nothing to stop cowboys coming in and teaching your child, or trying to teach your child, and charging you quite a lot of money for the privilege. I'm much happier with the idea of somebody who has a degree and a teaching qualification. Which isn't to say that there isn't a lot of variation in the quality of qualified teachers as well, but I think safer than having an unregulated tutoring profession.
Chris, you're a parent. Are you delighted the schools are reopening again? What impact do you think it's had on your daughter's education, and what should we do next?
Well, my only take home from this whole thing is that, firstly, I think my daughter's 9, and they are definitely doing harder work than we did at the same age. Maybe this comes down to the North-South thing. I was educated in the North and now I'm in the South. I don't think so, though. I think they did have made the stuff really difficult. And also, so much of it is totally useless. I mean, I don't think I've ever had to multiply fractions in my life, except at school. And I can't see what possible use it can be. Why are we teaching kids French in primary school? Why are we teaching kids French at all? The French are our natural enemies. We hate the French. They can learn English if they want to, but I mean, we don't go where Spanish might be useful. Maybe Mandarin probably would be useful. We're wasting our time. I spent 40 minutes every single day for 5 years at school learning French. I haven't been there for donkey's years, and I can't stand the place. It's a waste of time. So much of what they do is silly. And when you look at it again, as an adult, you think this is never going to come in handy. Algebra and matrices and all this kind of nonsense. We're wasting time. The government's constantly putting more and more things on the curriculum. It needs to get rid of a lot of this dead wood, most of which has been made obsolete by the invention of calculators.
Chris, fess up. What part of your 9-year-old daughter's homework were you unable to assist her with because it was too complicated? That sounds very much like what you're...
We struggle with the geometry, I must admit, working out the perpendicular and all this kind of stuff. But again, who needs it?
Ben, what's your view on this? The sort of, I mean, there's always been an argument about classical education against vocational training. I can remember going back 30 years, I quite enjoyed physics, but it was only one lesson that taught you how to wire a plug. All of the rest of it was, Newton this and the rest of it. But then what's your take on the kind of how prescriptive education is? Chris has obviously stated a preference about how he'd like his daughter to be educated. Is it too prescriptive at the moment?
Well, I do. I think, it's bizarre that the national curriculum was actually invented by the Conservatives under either Mrs. Thatcher or John Major, I'm not sure which. The whole idea of a national curriculum, it's a kind of totalitarian idea, I think, in a way. I think there ought to be much more choice. And of course, free schools and academies, as well as the independent sector, don't have to adhere rigorously to the national curriculum, and they can choose different things. A lot of independent schools, for example, don't do A-levels, they do international baccalaureate, which is in many ways a more interesting kind of qualification. So I think one of the things I'm kind of arguing for is let's not have everything dictated from the top. Let's have more choice for parents, more choice for schools. Let's do things a bit differently rather than expect that we will get the word down from a minister of, Secretary of State for Education changes. The last Secretary of State for Education who was any good, I think, was Michael Gove. And we've had 4 since then, none of which have lasted 2 years. They all want to chop and change and do things differently and so forth. Get them out of our hair. Let's let the schools free. Let's liberate the schools to do different things rather than try to devise a thing which is going to work for everybody.
Maybe, Len, I can just put Sean's concerns to you. I might paraphrase them wrongly, but about the more informal teaching, at least from the point of view of qualifications, so allowing someone who, might know about maths to teach maths, even if they haven't gone through the teacher qualification process. Why are you in favour of that, and how would you address Sean's point that
qualified teacher status is something which you don't have to teach in an independent school. Nobody at Eton is required to have qualified teacher status. Free schools and academies don't have to do this. It's the roughly just under 50% of school children who are in maintained schools where they do have to have qualified teacher status. I think, this is one of the areas I've talked about in a completely different context, talked about occupational regulation and the way in which that has spread throughout our economy. So that now 1 in 5 workers have to be certified or licensed by the state in one way or another. And I think this is an area where we could liberate things. There are a lot of people who've got skills, life skills, etc., from working in business, from working in the armed forces, from working in the police, or whatever it may be, who could contribute to our schools in a way. At the moment, what we've got in our schools is people who've never left school, basically. They're people who've gone from school to university to school again. It's also a very feminized profession, and I think that's something which we ought to have a think about. 75% of all teachers are female, and nearly 90% in primary schools are female. Now,
I think are mostly male, especially in secondary schools.
No, they're not. Overall,
head teachers.
Head teachers are.
Oh, head teachers. Yeah, maybe.
The people at the top.
But the point is that in primary schools, at least, kids don't get no significant male role models. They're taught almost exclusively by women. And I speak as somebody who's had 3 children.
I think that is a problem. I think that's a huge problem. Yeah, I completely agree with that.
So, what I'm saying is that we ought to, you want to make sure that the people you're having teaching are competent and so forth.
But you have to ask why. Yeah, but you have to ask why is the workforce in primary schools? Why are many teachers women? And is it to do with that women sometimes go into lower paid professions?
Well, of course, that may well be a point, Sian, but that's a kind of chicken and egg kind of situation in a way. It's something which we ought to be thinking about how we can shape that up. And one way maybe to be spread our net wider. We're going to get in the next few years, we're going to have a lot of people coming out of jobs which are going to horrendous, right? Because something like, I don't know, entertainment, the arts, things like this.
But there are schemes you can get into teaching. I mean, there are schemes where you can.
Yes, there are indeed. And we ought to be.
I mean, if you look at Lucy Kellaway's scheme, Now Teach, which is, that's very much the idea of have a second career or even a third career as a teacher. Go in your 50s. I mean, Lucy was a very, very, well-known, respected columnist on the Financial Times.
On the FT, yeah.
So there are ways into the profession if you want to do that, and I think that is a good idea. And I think the idea of having part-time teachers, which again is something that the Now Teach, entry scheme is expanding. I think that's a good idea too, because you get a different kind of person who maybe only wants to teach 3 days a week, but has immense expertise and knowledge that they're bringing with them from another career in another life. So
I would be a terrible teacher because I've overrun our time by 6 minutes, so I'd never take any notice of the school bell. I just want to finish by asking you though, Sian, about the national curriculum. Do you think it could be loosened somewhat? I mean, obviously you want kids to learn arithmetic and literacy skills, but do you think there could be a lot more freedom about whether you teach French or Spanish, or whether you specialize a bit in, I don't know, music or drama or a particular science or some such, like allow much more experimentation rather than sort of, you're 14, it's key stage X, therefore you've got to learn Macbeth on a Tuesday afternoon?
I mean, I think there are legitimate concerns that some subjects are being squeezed out, which are actually really quite important for kids, like art and music and sport, which I think are really important, and they're being squeezed out by a very, very academic curriculum and the EBAC and the 8 subjects. And I guess there's a lot of I guess there's quite a strong argument to say that kids need to be taught other things like entrepreneurial skills going into in the 21st century, because many of them will end up probably setting up their own businesses. I think there needs to be a lot of emphasis on things like computer skills and IT skills. But I also think it is a good idea that all kids get the same, that all kids are entitled to the same high standard of education and a good grounding in things like maths and English and the sciences, which are going to, I think, stand them in good stead whatever they go into. So maybe it's more a question of rethinking what is in a national curriculum quite often, so that it does keep pace with a rapidly changing world.
Chris, I'm going to give the very final word to you. I'm sorry you were so frustrated by your daughter's algebra problems, but David in the YouTube chat asks whether you think darts and snooker should be on the maths curriculum.
On the maths curriculum? Well, darts is a very good way of learning maths, subtraction. Obviously.
So is poker, by the way. I'm a big advocate of teaching people to play poker.
Yeah, I was snooker not so much, at least not with the breaks I tend to get. It's fairly easy to add up on those. But no, in all seriousness, economics. Just 10 hours of economics, I think, would transform the country. If everyone had to learn basic economics at school, it would do so much good, not least because the teachers themselves would have to learn it, which would improve things enormously.
Well, there you go. And that gives me a good point to end on, because on the IEA London YouTube channel, you'll be able to find, because the state hasn't provided it for you or hasn't made it mandatory, the IEA has provided some basic economic education for you, Econ 101 and economic history lessons, lots of short videos by our head of education, Dr. Steve Davies. Be sure to check them out. They're great if you're studying for economics A-level, or if you're just interested in the topic. And we brought that to you at, I was going to say for free. These things are not free. They're just unpriced. It's brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Monterey Trust. Sian, Chris, Len, thank you very much for spending your evening with us. Have a great evening. My thanks to Dan Hodges and Martin for joining us earlier today. Thanks for helping navigate our way through these choppy waters, or now we're moving away from water metaphors, helping us navigate our way on the one-way irreversible route to freedom, as the Prime Minister would have it. Whatever the future holds, you can be sure that the IEA YouTube channel will be here, injecting some sound free market thinking and policy analysis along the way. So if you're not yet subscribed on the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit the subscription button and the notification bell. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please hit the thumbs up. We've got a whole range of upcoming events. On Tuesday, the 9th of March at 6 p.m, I'll be joined by Charles Moore, the biographer of Margaret Thatcher, for our latest In Conversation event. And go to iea.org.uk to check out our events page on our website for the latest details. And if economic times are tough and you've got a good idea, you could be £50,000 richer. Just a reminder to everybody at home, there is still time to submit your essay for this year's Richard Koch Breakthrough Prize. We're looking for a free market, pro-entrepreneurial idea that would particularly help the left behind areas of Britain. The winning entry will get a prize of £50,000, but the deadline is fast approaching. That's about it for tonight. Thanks very much for watching. Have a good evening, Chris, Sian, Len, and all of you watching at home. Take care, be safe, be free. Over and out.